Honoring our officers lost in the line of duty. Meet the man supporting our shields, logging thousands of miles to memorialize our first responder heroes long after the headlines fade. Next. He's known as Henry Hollywood Morris. He has earned that Hollywood nickname. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But first, sir, just thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you for being here to talk about it.
Thank you for having me, Liz. I've admired you from afar for many years, your courage and the work you've done. So this has been a long time in the making.
Oh, gosh, I'm just so fortunate that you reached out, and I'm thrilled to tell this story. We're going to talk about all these trips you've been making, the video stories of these fallen officers, these heroes that you've put together from all across the country. I'm sure it's work you don't want to be doing, but you're called to do it. But just to start with, what led you on this calling, on this path a few years ago to launch Supporting Our Shields?
Absolutely, Liz. It was watching the summer of madness, as I call it, 2020. Our lives would connect, even though we wouldn't know it at the time, when we literally saw this movement grow about defunding the police. Everything that happened in the wake of the George Floyd incident, watching police be demonized, not only in Minneapolis, but all across the country. And for me, the David Dorn murder was just the straw that broke the camel's back. So originally, I didn't have the name Support Our Shields. I was just literally running my small business, and I wanted to reach out to the law enforcement agency. I was in a small town, Fruitland Park, Florida, had a plaque made and just went and set up a meeting with the chief, shared my life story basically with him, and to watch this, you have these two big guys that look like they were retired NFL linebackers moved to tears, and he asked me would I go to the town next door, and that led to another town and another town. And 3.5 years later, half the states in the country. But it literally started in the wake of the defund the police madness.
And you did not have an easy childhood by any means, but you always looked up to the police. Tell us more about that.
Yes. One major difference was that when I was a kid, police were held as heroes all throughout society, whether it was, TV, education. So that was the norm for me, like to have your favorite TV show be Chips. Also, my parents, who were not the model of law-abiding citizens, unfortunately, due to their domestic violence and substance abuse, that was my introduction into police being called to the house all the time. But it was the way that those officers handle very difficult situations, with small children. And I would say this about my parents also. They did not blame the police for their problems. So that was installed very early. They were honest that these were consequences of their own actions. And then you combine that with something that was started in the 80s, the DARE program, when you saw, basically the crack epidemic explode in America. So those cops coming to, my second grade class or third grade class had an impact on me that would last, well into adulthood.
Traveling to their departments to personally honor their memory is the least that I can do.
Then your video and your incredible editing skills, your deep convictions, obviously, to take these trips by air, you're taking long drives, basically, I know, all on your own dime to share these messages, to tell these stories. You've traveled more than 42,000 miles in that time with dozens of law enforcement agencies, 25 different states. What kind of an emotional toll has that taken on you, Hollywood?
The exact word, Liz, is heavy, because especially in the last 12 months, what I realized, and you sadly predicted this would happen through your experience with your husband, that we were going to have a lot of good officers retire early and walk away from the calling. That was going to cause a vacuum effect. And what I noticed being out on the road is, one, the age of the officers are getting younger and younger that we're losing. One name that stood out to me last year was Jessica Eberhausen, who was 19 years old and on her way to the academy when she was killed. And for me,
he was only 23 years old.
All of these officers,
Deputy Lyson was only 29 years old.
Very similar to a tragic documentary, because I only know their story after we've lost them. That is what sticks with you after you meet the family members, the spouses, in some cases, like in Minnesota with Deputy Owens, seeing the note that his son left for his dad. That is what stays with you long after, you've actually, that I've had the presentation and met with the officers.
I do want to talk about this area specifically here in Minnesota. Just recently, the horrific call that killed 2 Burnsville officers and a fire medic. You know how much people here have been hurting, how much they've experienced. You flew to Minneapolis, and I know, sadly, just to think about this, you drive to Fargo to honor Jake Wallin, then to Pope County in Minnesota to honor fallen Deputy Josh Owen at the Pope County Sheriff's Department. You were then in Wisconsin on this same trip to honor Hunter Scheel, Emily Breidenbach, and Katie Leasing. Talk more about that, your trip here, Hollywood, getting to know just a bit about these fallen officers. And you're right, they are so young and had so much life ahead of them.
That is the part that makes the trip so difficult, knowing they had so much life in front of them, and all of them had 2 things in common: the calling to be a law enforcement officer and to serve their communities, and also that they had all done this before actually becoming officers, whether it was through military, other first responder responsibilities. So that was a week-long trip for me last summer. The bright line, or the bright light in it, was the people that I met in Fargo, North Dakota, in Chautauqua, Wisconsin. I had never been to Wisconsin before in my life. In Village of Cameron, these are places, if you would have asked me to find them on a map, I would have failed miserably outside of Minneapolis. But you go to these towns and you meet some amazing people that, other words, unless you were just going for an out of the way tourist experience, you would never meet. So, for example, Pope County, talking with not only Josh Owens, the officers that were left behind and are still dealing with his loss, but to be taken, to the municipal building, literally right across the street from everything that tragic day unfolded, and to literally read some of the statements from the people who lived in this community about what he had meant to them. And to fast forward to the end of that week, Village of Cameron, I meet Chief Stiffen. He literally now only has 1 other full-time officer. This is how small their department was. So when they lost Hunter, he explained to me, he said, Hollywood, I went to school with Hunter's dad. We played football together, and now I have to go over to his house and let him know that his son is not coming home. These are the stories that the mainstream media will never share, because it doesn't create the narrative of cops are out hunting unarmed Black men. So if it doesn't fit that narrative, they could care less. I've learned about the lives that we've lost and the families that are left with a giant hole, because their husband, their son, their wife, their daughters are no longer with them, all because they literally answered that call and put their lives on the line for people they never knew.
You've said that even now, some churches, some nonprofits have been resistant to your message, still siding with Black Lives Matter, despite, of course, what we know about that organization now. You've been called a sellout for doing something like this. It's just unreal to me how you've been criticized for the work you're doing.
Yes, it's unfortunate, Liz, but for me, not expected, because you're not allowed to go against the narrative.
Welcome to the post-truth era.
Then, they have to attack you personally and attack the work that you're doing, because I understand about a calling, because the same way these officers are called to lay their lives on the line every day so that we can pursue the American dream and all the freedoms that come from being an American citizen. I realized, Liz, that the last 25 years, working with so many churches and nonprofits, a lot of the funding comes from servicing the problems, but never addressing them. That mentality has led to a more dangerous profession for law enforcement. When you combine the rhetoric that you've seen, and of course it exploded in 2020, but if we go back to Ferguson 2014, we're talking about a decade timeline where this has been building and building. And so now we're seeing all of the fallout from basically 10 years of what I call evil propaganda that is wreaking havoc. on the men and women of law enforcement. And a lot of these people, these quote unquote leaders,
the vast majority of people that have come together have been doing so peacefully.
Vince Ellison calls it the Iron Triangle. He talks about the preachers, the political leaders, and the community activists. They have a script that they stick to so they can continue to get the funding, and they could care less whether the police are thrown under the bus as long as it enriches them. And you saw it play out in real time with Black Lives Matter, but they're just the tip. You know, it goes deeper than Patrisse Cullors, I guarantee you.
It's no secret this defund and, as you say, demoralize the police. The message has had devastating effects. In Minnesota alone, assault incidents against officers are up 160% from a decade ago, according to the Department of Public Safety. What have you found, though, in your travels? What keeps these men and women even doing this job at this point in Hollywood?
It's not just Minnesota, Liz, but all across the country, in every state, that the 25 that I've gone to, the assaults and the attacks on police are up. And it's one of the sadder points about doing this and meeting with them firsthand, is you realize, and I've shared this with them, you know, from someone who's coming from a media background, what I've shared with various sheriffs and chiefs are police officers make the perfect target, because these are men and women that rarely complain, and they literally will answer the call. And if they did not take the pride in their calling that they do, they would not be such an easy target, because we could name thousands of professions that would have thrown their hands up by now and said, okay, if we're the problem, then we quit. And that has been one of the saddest trends that I've noticed, especially last year, Liz, traveling, was I know of at least 4 cases that officer was not supposed to be on call that day. For example, Keenest Kroom in Meridian, Mississippi, it was his day off, but the chief told me they're almost 30 officers short. So he's literally arguing with his supervisor to let him come in, and that would be his last day alive. But he did not want to leave his brothers and sisters shorthanded. So he was fighting to come to work that day when he answered that last call.
Wow. You're using your retirement funds, I know, to pay for all of this. Your travel, these plaque presentations, I know it's that important to you to continue telling these stories, but where can people go to help your mission, to see the stories, and to honor these heroes alongside you, Hollywood?
Yes, I laugh, Liz, because I've become the emperor of extended stay America. I've had to be real cautious with the budget, but if anyone wants to help, the website is supportourshields.com, and I'm actually connected with Fund the First. And so, you know, they do a lot of fundraising with law enforcement officers all across the country, different issues that they are going through. And unfortunately, we're not in March yet, and we are down 20 officers, Liz, this year. Unless the propaganda is stopped and literally private citizens continue standing up and speaking out, I think that this is going to be a very disappointing trend. And so that is why already this year, I literally, as we're talking, have already 7 stops, you know, planned out for officers that we've lost in the first 6 weeks of the year. This is an epidemic that the media refuses to talk about.
You're right. It makes the news for a couple days and fades away.
Yes.
God bless you for the work you're doing. It is heartbreaking. So important, though. Again, Hollywood Morris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. We have to encourage each other. I share a football analogy. I know you're there in Minnesota, go Vikings, but we are in the 4th quarter. Literally, I feel we're nearing the 2-minute warning of the nation that we grew up in and gave us all of the opportunities that we enjoy. If we don't put silly differences aside and stop allowing what the enemies of freedom are using to divide us, in the case that we've seen in the last 4 years, it's been our skin tone, we will lose the greatest country ever known to man. And we can't do this. So we cannot continue to be cowards to comfort. We have to speak up and get active and stand up and stand with those who are literally dying for the freedoms that we enjoy every day. We cannot take it for granted any longer.
Couldn't agree more. Again, Hollywood, thank you. That will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.